Welcome to Dark Hour Tales. Tonight's tale is The Nightmare Widow. Rachel Anderson had not seen the old woman for 9 years, but she recognized her before she had even properly understood what she was looking at. It was shortly after 11 on a cold November evening, and Rachel was standing in the kitchen of the house she had bought with her fiancé, Tom, 6 months earlier. They had spent most of the evening painting the spare bedroom and arguing good-naturedly over whether the color Rachel had chosen looked warm or simply brown. Tom had eventually declared himself finished for the night, ordered food and gone upstairs to shower, while Rachel carried mugs and paint-stained plates downstairs. She was rinsing a cup when she glanced through the kitchen window. Across the road, beneath a streetlight, stood an elderly woman dressed entirely in black. Rachel stopped moving. The mug slipped from her hand, struck the side of the sink, and shattered on the floor. Tom heard the crash from upstairs and called down to ask what had happened. Rachel did not answer. She remained beside the sink, staring through the glass. The woman was small, perhaps slightly below average height, and so old that even from across the road, Rachel could see the natural stoop in her posture. A long black morning dress reached almost to her ankles. Dark shoes showed beneath the hem, while black gloves covered both hands. A veil hung from an old-fashioned black hat and obscured her face. There was nothing physically threatening about her. She looked as though a strong wind might trouble her. Rachel was more frightened than she had been at any point in the previous 9 years. Tom entered the kitchen in a t-shirt and tracksuit bottoms, saw the broken mug, and asked whether Rachel had cut herself. When she failed to respond, he followed her gaze towards the window. "Who's that?" Rachel tried to answer, but her mouth had gone dry. Tom looked again. The elderly woman remained beneath the streetlight. Rachel finally said, "She came for Daniel." Tom turned towards her. Rachel had told him about her brother before, although never everything. Tom knew Daniel had disappeared when Rachel was 25, and that the police investigation had never established where he went. He knew there had been strange circumstances surrounding the weeks before his disappearance, but Rachel had always resisted describing them because saying the details aloud made them sound impossible. Tom looked back through the window. The woman had not moved. "What do you mean she came for Daniel?" Rachel stepped away from the glass. 9 years ago, before he disappeared, that woman started standing outside his flat. Tom studied her face and realized she was serious. "Rachel, she must be 90. "I know." "You're saying that's the same person?" "I know how it sounds." Tom moved towards the back door. Rachel caught his arm. "Don't go out there." "I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to ask if she's all right." "No." Tom hesitated. Rachel rarely sounded frightened. She became irritated, stressed, and occasionally angry, but genuine fear was unusual enough that Tom stopped with his hand near the lock. Rachel told him what had happened to Daniel. The first time her brother mentioned the woman, he had laughed about it. He was 28, living alone in a flat near Leeds, and working irregular shifts as a mechanic. One night, he noticed an elderly woman dressed entirely in black standing across from his building. She stayed there for nearly an hour. Daniel assumed she was confused or waiting for someone. The next night, she returned. This time, she stood near the entrance to the car park. 2 nights later, Rachel visited and saw her herself. The woman was standing in the communal garden beneath Daniel's bedroom window. Daniel called the police. By the time officers arrived, she had vanished. The following night, she appeared outside the main entrance. Daniel stopped sleeping at the flat and moved temporarily into their parents' house. The old woman appeared across from that house the following evening. Rachel remembered Daniel standing beside her at the living room window, no longer pretending any of it was funny. He had told her that the woman was getting closer. 3 nights later, Daniel disappeared from a locked upstairs bedroom. There was no broken window and no damage to the door. His phone remained charging beside the bed. His shoes, wallet, and clothes were still in the house. Rachel remembered hearing footsteps on the landing shortly before he vanished. Slow footsteps. The careful movement of someone very old. Tom listened without interrupting. When Rachel finished, he looked through the window again. The streetlight was empty. Tom unlocked the back door before Rachel could stop him. He crossed the garden, opened the gate, and walked onto the pavement. Rachel remained inside, watching through the glass. The elderly woman was nowhere visible. Tom crossed the road and looked in both directions. A car passed. When he returned several minutes later, his expression was more uncertain than before. "There's nobody there." Rachel nodded. "I know." They did not sleep much that night. By morning, the story seemed less possible. Tom suggested that Rachel had recognized a superficial resemblance and panicked because of what happened to Daniel. Rachel wanted to believe him. 9 years was a long time, and the woman she remembered had already looked ancient then. It made little sense that she would appear almost unchanged. Rachel went to work. She taught year 5 at a primary school 15 minutes from home and spent most of the day forcing herself to concentrate on lessons, playground duties, and the endless administrative tasks that filled the spaces between them. By late afternoon, ordinary life had begun to weaken the memory of the previous night. Then Rachel opened an old box in the wardrobe after returning home. Inside were newspaper clippings about Daniel, police appeals, photographs, copies of emails her mother had printed and saved. One message had been sent by a woman named Margaret Cole 7 months after Daniel disappeared. Rachel remembered it immediately. Margaret's husband had vanished in 1998. Before his disappearance, an elderly woman dressed in black had appeared outside their home for several nights. Rachel had never replied. Her mother had exchanged messages with Margaret for a while, but eventually the correspondence stopped and Rachel pushed the entire thing out of her life. She searched the old email address. To her surprise, Margaret answered that evening. Rachel explained as little as possible. She said the woman in black had returned and that this time she seemed to be watching Rachel. Margaret called within 5 minutes. Her first question was not who Rachel meant. It was, how close? Rachel sat at the kitchen table. Across the road. Margaret was silent for a moment before telling Rachel she still had time. Rachel asked what that meant. Margaret explained that she had spent years speaking to families who experienced similar disappearances. Nobody knew what the woman was or where the missing people went, but certain patterns repeated. She chose one person. She appeared only at night. Each night she came closer. Everyone nearby could see her, but she ignored anyone except the person she had chosen. Distance did not matter. Locked doors did not matter. Margaret told Rachel that families had tried hotels, hospitals, relatives' houses, and long drives across the country. The woman simply appeared again. Rachel asked whether anyone had survived. Margaret hesitated. A few for a while. For a while? I don't know anyone she chose who I can prove escaped permanently. Rachel looked towards the dark kitchen window. Tom had already closed the curtains. Margaret asked whether Rachel had ever seen the woman before Daniel disappeared. Rachel said yes. The line became quiet. Then Margaret told her something Rachel had never known. People who see her sometimes get chosen later. Rachel felt cold. How much later? Months, years. There doesn't seem to be a pattern. Rachel thought about the 9 years between Daniel and now. Margaret told her not to stay alone and not to assume leaving town would help. Before ending the call, she repeated one thing. If she comes closer tonight, call me. Rachel did not have to. Tom saw the widow first. At 12:07 a.m., he was standing upstairs near the front bedroom window when he suddenly called Rachel's name. She heard enough in his voice to know what he had seen before reaching him. The old woman stood outside their garden gate. There was no longer a road between them. Rachel looked down at the tiny black figure. From the upper floor, the widow seemed even less physically threatening. Her shoulders were narrow beneath the morning dress, and her posture was slightly stooped. Both gloved hands rested together in front of her. Tom took out his phone. Rachel told him photographs would not help. He tried anyway. The image showed the gate and pavement. No woman. Tom lowered the phone. She remained there. They called the police. 2 officers arrived 20 minutes later. Rachel expected embarrassment when she explained that an elderly woman had been standing outside the house repeatedly, but the officers became more serious when Tom confirmed seeing the same person. The widow was still at the gate when the police car arrived. Both officers saw her. One approached slowly and asked whether she needed help. The widow did not respond. The officer moved closer. His colleague turned briefly towards Rachel and Tom. When he looked back, the widow was gone. The first officer stopped. He looked around the street, then behind the neighboring hedge and along the side of the house. There was nowhere an elderly woman could have reached in the time both officers had looked away. The police searched nearby streets and found nothing. Tom never again suggested Rachel had imagined her. The following morning, Rachel called Margaret and told her what happened. Margaret listened quietly before asking whether the widow had touched her veil. Rachel said no. Margaret told her that was good. Then she explained the rule she had avoided mentioning before. The night Margaret's husband disappeared, the old woman had reached the front of their house. Margaret watched from upstairs while the widow slowly raised one gloved hand towards her veil. Her husband understood before Margaret did. He shouted at her to close her eyes. Margaret obeyed. She heard him scream once. When she opened her eyes again, the veil was back in place. Her husband disappeared before sunrise. Margaret later learned of other cases containing the same detail. When she shows the person her face, Margaret said, she takes them that night. Rachel asked what was underneath the veil. Margaret replied that she had never seen it. Rachel was grateful. The third night, Rachel's younger sister Laura came to stay. Laura was 30 and had been 16 when Daniel disappeared. She remembered the widow too. Their parents had tried for years to convince themselves that grief had distorted everyone's memories, but Laura had never forgotten the old woman standing outside their childhood home. Shortly before midnight, Laura looked through the upstairs window. Rachel was beside her when she stopped breathing. The widow stood halfway along the garden path. She was closer again. Tom locked the doors, checked every ground floor window, and brought a toolbox upstairs, despite openly admitting that locks had apparently meant nothing in Daniel's case. Laura wanted to leave. Tom agreed. Rachel remembered Margaret's warning but understood why staying felt impossible. They packed a few essentials and left shortly after 1 in the morning. Tom drove towards his brother's house 40 miles away. For the first half hour, nothing happened. Streetlights disappeared behind them, and the road narrowed through open countryside. Rachel gradually began to believe distance might matter after all. Then Tom slowed. Someone stood beside the road ahead. A small elderly woman in black mourning clothes. Nobody spoke. Tom accelerated and passed her. Rachel turned in her seat. The widow remained beside the verge, motionless beneath the headlights as the car moved away. Laura began crying quietly. 10 minutes later, they saw her again. This time she stood farther ahead at the entrance to a farm road. There was no possible way she could have traveled there. Tom drove past without slowing. Rachel asked him to turn around. Being on an unfamiliar road in the middle of the night suddenly felt worse than returning home. They arrived back shortly before 3. The widow was not visible. The following night, she stood directly outside the living room window. Tom saw her through the curtains and instinctively closed them. Rachel immediately asked him to open them again. He looked at her as though she had lost her mind. Rachel explained that not knowing where the widow was felt worse than seeing her. Tom pulled the curtain aside. The garden was empty. Laura called from the kitchen. Rachel and Tom hurried through. The widow stood outside the back door. Nobody had seen her walk around the house. Tom switched on the exterior light. The old woman remained perfectly still. Her veil moved slightly in the wind. Rachel felt sick. Then the widow slowly turned her head toward the kitchen window. She was looking directly at Rachel. Tom pulled her away. When he checked again moments later, the garden was empty. The following day, Rachel stopped going to work. Tom called in sick. Laura refused to leave. Margaret spoke to Rachel several times, but there was very little advice left to give. She knew of no ritual, prayer, or method that stopped the widow. She had spent nearly 20 years looking for one. Rachel asked how Margaret herself had survived. Margaret answered, "She wasn't there for me." That sentence stayed with Rachel. The widow did not care about Tom or Laura. Not yet. They were witnesses. Rachel was the person she had chosen. On the 5th night, they waited upstairs. Nobody suggested leaving again. Tom pushed a chest of drawers against the bedroom door, even though all 3 knew it was unlikely to help. Laura sat beside Rachel on the bed while Tom remained near the window. Every downstairs light was on. At 12:41 a.m., the front door opened. They heard the latch clearly. There was no impact and no breaking glass. The door simply opened downstairs. A few seconds later, it closed again. Rachel took Laura's hand. The house remained quiet for almost a minute. Then a floorboard creaked in the hallway. Another followed. The sound was slow, measured. The widow was walking through the house at the pace of an extremely elderly woman. That made it worse. There was no rush because there was nowhere Rachel could go. Tom stood beside the bedroom door holding a heavy torch, although nobody believed it would be useful. The first stair creaked, then another. Each step seemed separated by several seconds. Laura covered her mouth with one hand. Rachel listened to the widow climb. She imagined the small, stooped figure placing one dark shoe carefully onto each step and using the banister like any elderly visitor. Eventually, the staircase became quiet. Nobody spoke. Soft fabric moved somewhere outside the bedroom. The door handle lowered. The chest of drawers shifted several inches across the carpet. Tom pushed against it. The door continued opening. The furniture moved as though there were nothing unusual about its weight. Tom stepped backwards. The widow entered. She was smaller than Rachel remembered. Her age was unmistakable at this distance. The skin visible around the edges of the veil was pale and heavily lined. Her shoulders were narrow, and the black mourning dress hung loosely from a body that seemed almost fragile. She ignored Tom. She ignored Laura. Her veiled face remained directed towards Rachel. Then her right hand began to rise. Rachel knew exactly what was happening. Tom reacted first. He switched off the bedroom light and pulled his coat over Rachel's head. Laura closed her eyes. Rachel pressed both hands against the fabric and refused to look. The room became completely quiet. Rachel heard the faint movement of clothing. Then Tom made a sound she had never heard from him before. Not a scream, something smaller and more frightened. Rachel understood that he had seen beneath the veil. She kept her eyes covered. Seconds passed. Then came the soft movement of fabric again. A footstep crossed the room. Another followed. The bedroom door moved. The widow began walking away. Rachel remained beneath the coat. She listened to the slow steps crossing the landing and descending the staircase. Eventually, she heard the front door open, then close. Nobody moved until morning. Tom refused to describe what he had seen. Rachel asked once. He told her never to ask again. The widow did not return the following night. She did not return the night after that. A week passed. Then a month. Rachel called Margaret repeatedly during the first few weeks, but neither woman knew whether the veil had to be seen directly by the chosen person or whether Rachel had simply interrupted something that would eventually continue. Nothing happened. 6 months later, Rachel and Tom moved house. A year passed, then 18 months. Gradually, Rachel stopped checking the opposite pavement every time she opened the curtains after dark. She returned to teaching. She and Tom finally married in a small ceremony attended by friends and family. Laura gave a speech that made Rachel cry. For a while, life became ordinary again. Then Laura called one evening shortly after 10. Rachel knew something was wrong immediately. Her sister's breathing was unsteady. Rachel asked what had happened. Laura said, "Do you remember the first night?" Rachel stood from the sofa. "What first night?" "When she came for you." Rachel closed her eyes. Laura began crying. "She's here." Rachel asked where. Laura told her she was standing across the road. For several seconds, Rachel could hear nothing except her sister breathing through the phone. Then Rachel asked the same question Margaret had asked her 18 months earlier. "How close?" Laura repeated that the widow was still on the opposite pavement. Rachel told her not to leave the house and said she was coming immediately. Tom looked at Rachel and understood before she explained. They drove to Laura's home. By the time they arrived, darkness had settled completely. Laura opened the door before Rachel reached it and pulled her inside. The curtains were closed. Rachel crossed the living room slowly. She already knew what she would see. Laura stood several feet behind her. Tom remained near the door. Rachel moved one curtain aside. Across the road, beneath a streetlight, stood a small elderly woman dressed entirely in black. She appeared exactly as Rachel remembered, ancient, slightly stooped. Her gloved hands rested calmly together. The veil concealed her face. Rachel felt the same fear she had experienced 18 months earlier, but this time the widow was not looking at her. Her attention was fixed entirely on Laura. Rachel released the curtain. For 9 years, she had believed Daniel's disappearance was something she had survived. Then the widow returned for Rachel. Rachel had survived again. Now she finally understood that surviving the nightmare widow did not end anything. It only meant being there when she eventually chose someone else.